Okay, so we have the conclusion of the poem, and again, what we're looking for is the change, well, the style features in it, but also the change in the poet's um, purpose and perspective in this final section. So here we've got this scene that we end the previous stanza with this frantic hurrying of the people around to collect the water. And there's something interesting about the beginning of this final stanza with the naked children. We have the adults, I think, and the children in this previous stanza frantically trying to collect water. But then what we have are children, I think, engaging in the pleasure of the water itself, perhaps not fully conscious of its value, perhaps not fully conscious of the dire situation that they're in that makes it so precious and valuable, the drought and poverty. And so what we then have, I think, is these naked children functioning as a symbol of innocence and vulnerability. That we end the poem with the most vulnerable of the characters that populate this scene, innocently playing in the water itself. So these children, I think, function as a symbol of innocence and vulnerability. Importantly, then, they're seen screaming in the liquid sun. They're seen screaming in the water, and the water looks like liquid sun because it's reflecting the sun off of the skins of the children. But here the word screaming is important. The lexis here, the choice of this dramatic verb, and its ambiguity is what is important here. It suggests both joy and pain. And I think shows us, a lack of awareness of its causes on the part of these naked children. They're screaming in the liquid sun. They don't really know why. They are joyful, and perhaps there's a suggestion of their pain here. So that ambiguity, I think, makes us feel uncomfortable. The poet's deliberately trying to make us feel uncomfortable about seeing this seemingly optimistic moment as a good thing. We should not, I think, according to this poet, see this sudden accidental deliverance of water as some sort of blessing, because we shouldn't be in a situation where it means so much to so many people, i.e. everyone should have access to clean water. They're screaming in the liquid sun, and again this imagery here is, I think, a metaphor also for the water, but the imagery of the liquid sun is that, I think, that on the skin of the children, the sun reflecting in the water. And that imagery, I think, gives us a sense of a mirage, because it's describing the water itself as some kind of sun and of a reflection, and makes it seem like the water and the sun are blending, that the water is the sun and that it's on the skin of the children. I think in some way that builds a suggestion of almost like lava, of burning and torture. So they're screaming in the liquid sun. If you take that line out of the context of this poem, where we know that the children are in water, it sounds like boiling hot lava or magma from a volcano. So that imagery, I think, builds into this suggestion of pain and torture that this final stanza is deliberately trying to partly evoke. It's partly a good thing, it's partly a bad, and there's a lot of ambiguity in these final lines. Then we see their children, their highlights polished to perfection. So you're thinking about the highlights of the children. And again, that word itself is ambiguous. It's an ambiguous lexical choice, a lexis that's ambiguous. One, because people's highlights generally are their best features. And the best feature of these children, polished to perfection, as if they are little statues that are being, the appearance of them is being improved by the water. But also their highlights, I think what we see when we think of children in poverty, the bits of their body that are highlighted are often things that show how vulnerable and poor and often hungry they are. You know, we're talking here about ribs and shoulder blades and bones. Those are the things that are being polished to perfection, as if the water itself is shaping their bodies in a way that showcases their poverty and their lack of wealth. So although it seems that sometimes to be the best features of somebody, their highlights, here, in these children, it's their bones, which are, in many cases, their points of vulnerability, the things that show how poor and hungry they are. And again, polished to perfection are plosives, and we associate them with violence. So I think the plosives here, the polishing to perfection of the bones of the children, that alliteration, shows us the power of water to shape the children like sculpture. And the water shouldn't have that power. It shouldn't have that power over people's lives. So it's shaping them, polishing them to perfection, shaping their destiny and their identity, which is then revealed as being out of the hands of the children. If their highlights are being polished to perfection by water, it's the same sort of idea as the lines above the poem, where, in the middle stanza, where the flow has found a roar of tongues. Again, the water is finding the people, and the water here is polishing the people to perfection, the children. So it's the water with all the power. And then we have this sudden, short line, flashing light. And I think is again an instance of symbolism. What we're talking about here is water reflecting off the skin of the children. Those sudden flashes of light, I think, give us those minuscule little reasons for optimism or hope, but at the same time suggest if they're only flashing, that they're transient, that they're only temporary, and that they change, they're impermanent. They're transient, impermanent, or fleeting. They will leave us as quickly as they arrive, those moments of optimism. Then we have I find these very disturbing final lines, as the blessing sings over their small bones. So the blessing that's singing over the bones of the children is a metaphor for the water. The water itself is a blessing, which completes this extended metaphor of the water as some kind of ceremony, like a baptism, where the blessing is singing with joy over the bones of the children. They're being protected. The water is offering an example of God's intervention, God's watchful protection of them. But then there's something uncomfortable about this. The blessing sings. The water is personified and makes it seem again like a ceremony. The blessing is singing over their small bones. So the blessing sounds at this point beneficent. It sounds kind and joyful, that it's singing and offering a sort of hymn of celebration over their little bones, over their meagre, thin bodies. But that personification of the water makes it seem at this moment in time joyful. The water is singing over their bones. It's also, again, a mixture of senses. But then when you take this whole image together, the blessing sings over their small bones. This imagery, I think, ends the poem with a suggestion of a different problem, an ambiguity. So we have this suggestion of the blessing singing over. If you sing over something, you sing in a way almost as if you don't notice what's beneath it. So yes, the blessing of water has arrived, but that isn't going to change the fact that they have small bones, because their small bones are to do with malnutrition. They're to do with hunger. So yes, this flashing light, this moment of optimism about accidental water delivery seems to be a good thing. But this singing over their small bones makes it seem uncomfortable. It makes it seem like it has power over these children. And that this final image highlights a problem that this particular blessing is not going to solve. This is not going to make them well nourished. It's not going to suddenly make them big built, and healthy. And so what we end then with is this poem that is entirely about the arrival of water. And the final image presents us with a new problem that the water cannot solve. And so what we then see is, from the beginning, we've seen this. Imagine how awful it is without water, what a basic human right that should be. And then we get to the point where it arrives, and then the poet is saying to us, and yet this is only one tiny little factor in the lives of these desperately poor people and their desperately thin children. And so what we then see is that, I think, an implied criticism of the view that this water is a blessing to these people, because it's a temporary one, and it's insufficient in terms of actually delivering them from the difficult poverty that they find themselves in. So the poet's position in this final stanza seems to be an implied criticism of the view that the poem presents of seeing the arrival of water as some kind of protection from God.